On August 24, 2013, men and women are walking through the forest near the village of Reshoti, which is 25 kilometers from Yekaterinburg, Russia. The weather is warm, there's no wind, so the mushroom pickers first notice the smoke, and only then do they start to smell it. A thin wisp of smoke rises from a fire pit not far from the edge of the forest. Someone didn't put out their campfire properly again, the couple sighs. They'll have to do it themselves. The man and woman approach the fire and almost immediately freeze, unable to believe their eyes. In the fire pit, lying face down, is the naked corpse of a woman. The smoke carries the smell of burnt flesh to the couple, and the woman starts to feel sick. The police who arrive take the charred body to Yekaterinburg to the Forensic Bureau. Within a week, the body is identified as 28-year-old Yuliya Prokopieva, the wife of the well-known photographer Dmitry Loshagin. And a year and a half later, Loshagin himself will be sent to a penal colony for taking his wife's life, despite the lack of direct evidence in the case.
In your opinion, why did you end up behind bars? Why are you here? What is the reason? Editor.
I still don't understand why this nonsense is happening in my life.
But you keep fighting as far as I know.
Yes, we're currently at the cassation stage.
This case still remains one of the most controversial and mysterious in criminal history, if not of Russia, then at least of the Urals. Today's episode is very thorough, and it's no coincidence that I'm recording this line with an especially nasal, congested voice. Because today, you'll have the chance to draw your own conclusion based on all the theories and form your own opinion, which you can then write in the comments. And don't read the comments until you've watched the video. Also, in the video, I'll sometimes mix up the last names Prokopchik and Prokopchuk, and that's terrible. Dmitry Loshagin was born in Yekaterinburg in 1978. He grew up in a well-off family and was a beloved child. At school, Dmitry was involved in photography and achieved his first major success at the age of 16. In Crimea, his first photo exhibition were organized. After finishing school, Loshagin entered the Faculty of Economics at the Ural State Technical University.
Even after receiving an economics education, I continued to develop my photo studio.
He didn't give up photography. On the contrary, he got a job at the well-known local modeling agency Alexandri. There, he worked as the chief photographer, commercial director, and art manager. At the same time, Loshagin participated in various competitions and received prizes more than once. After university, Loshagin decided that he would go into business. He opened his own photo studio, which quickly became well known in Russia and abroad. For many years, he was officially the photographer for the Miss Yekaterinburg contest. In 2004, Loshagin met his future first wife, model Tatyana Grigorieva. At that time, the girl was 17. The couple got married in 2006, and Tatyana later gave birth to a son, Daniil, but in 2010 they divorced. Nevertheless, the former spouses maintained a business relationship, and Tatyana later took part in many of Loshagin's projects. A short time after the divorce, Loshagin started dating Yuliya Prokopieva, a 26-year-old model from Nizhny Tagil. He had met Yuliya 10 years earlier, when she was only 16. Back then, dreaming of becoming a model, she decided to take part in the Miss Nizhny Tagil beauty contest. Dmitry really liked the girl, and he offered to put together a portfolio for her for free. Their relationship didn't turn into anything more back then, but Yuliya remembered that meeting. Their relationship developed quite quickly. Loshagin suggested that they do a photo shoot in India, and then he proposed to her. They got married in Prague. The ceremony was beautiful and romantic. Yuliya kept her last name Prokopieva after the wedding. Shortly after the wedding, Loshagin bought a 2-story loft in Yekaterinburg, where the couple moved. Loshagin set up his studio in the loft and called it Loshagin Loft Art Space. There, he regularly gathered the elite and representatives of the bohemian scene, photographers, artists, and designers. Loshagin's parties were extravagant, and both Yuliya and Dmitry gladly welcomed guests. Around this time, Loshagin began having conflicts with his ex-wife Tatiana. The woman claimed that Loshagin stopped paying child support and stopped seeing his son altogether, stating that the child was not his, and therefore he was not obligated to provide any financial support. Yuliya also contributed to the cooling of their relationship. She was jealous of her husband's relationship with Tatiana and didn't want them to work together. Tatiana was forced to leave Dmitry's agency and got a job as a manager at the bar of the Hyatt Hotel. From the outside, it seemed that the Loshagin couple lived in perfect harmony and were madly in love with each other. They were always holding hands, calling each other amor, and talking about how happy they were. In one interview, Dmitry said that his biggest dream was to become a grandfather, to walk along the beach, and to hold Yuliya's hand for his whole life. But the beautiful fairy tale didn't last long. It all ended in tragedy. On August 31, 2013, the police in Yekaterinburg received a statement from Mikhail Ryabov, the brother of Yuliya Prokopieva, who lived in Nizhny Tagil. He said that his sister hadn't been in touch for over a week and her husband Dmitry was behaving strangely. The very next day, Yuliya's relatives were invited to identify the body of a woman whose corpse had been found on August 24, 50 meters from the Staromoskovsky tract in the forest near the village of Resheti. The strange thing started even then. Only Yuliya's mother, Svetlana Ryabova, and her brother came to the identification. At the same time, Dmitry Loshagin refused to go to the morgue. When Svetlana arrived at the morgue, she was warned to prepare herself. The body she was about to see had been in a fire. There was almost no hair or skin left on the left side. The face was burned down to the bone. Svetlana felt her knees give way at that moment. Summoning her courage, she entered the identification room and, approaching the table, looked at the corpse. The body lying on the table really did look terrible, but the woman didn't scream out of fear. Unfortunately, due to YouTube's censorship, I can't show some documentary materials, so I'll leave them in the Telegram channel /noti. Go ahead, subscribe and watch. The link is below the video. On the fingernails of the right hand, which was almost untouched by burns, Yuliya's mother noticed traces of nail polish, the same as her daughter's when she last saw her. The body on the table could indeed have belonged to Yuliya Prokopieva. Death occurred as a result of a broken neck, the experts reported. When the body was burned, the victim was already dead. But this didn't make it any easier for Svetlana. She could barely stand on her feet. The woman was asked to provide the lab with a sample of her DNA to finally establish the identity of the deceased. An analysis had to be conducted. There was still a chance that this wasn't Yuliya's body. There was still a possibility that the nail polish color was just a coincidence. But the tests confirmed the burned body was Yuliya Prokopieva. A mistake was ruled out. The investigators immediately went to the Loshagin residence. Dmitry, who met them, seemed shocked by the news of his wife's death but behaved quite calmly. He did not resist when he was asked to come to the station, and he gave his testimony methodically, carefully choosing his words. Loshagin stated that he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance or her death. According to him, on the night of August 22nd into the 23rd, there was a party at his house with more than 10 guests. Yuliya was at the party with him, and when the guests left, she left the apartment without explanation and went to parts unknown. She had done this before. Sometimes she would just run off into the night, drive around the city, walk somewhere, and then come back home as if nothing had happened. That's exactly why he wasn't alarmed when she disappeared. That's also why he didn't go to the police. He was sure his wife would come back. Yuliya had that kind of personality. She was very impulsive, easily swayed by emotions, and reacted strongly to everything, Loshagin said. Sometimes she would even fly abroad, and then I would call her and ask where she was, and she would say, "I'm in Istanbul, I'll be back soon." However, the investigators did not believe his explanation. Moreover, Yuliya's relatives all said that she didn't have that kind of character and that the couple always traveled together. And after the interrogation, Dmitry Loshagin became the main suspect. His behavior during those days was indeed extremely suspicious. On September 2, Loshagin posted an ad to sell his studio apartment, which he valued at 50 million rubles. Of course, by studio apartment, we don't mean a one-room apartment with a combined kitchen, but rather an apartment plus a working studio, Loshagin's loft. That same day, he left the apartment and disappeared without a trace. He was declared wanted. On September 3, 2013, Dmitry Loshagin was detained in Pervoralsk. During the search, officers seized plane tickets to Moscow and Simferopol from him. Loshagin stated that he wasn't planning to fly anywhere and had gone to Pervoralsk simply on business. However, he again did not resist during the arrest. Repeated interrogations began, and almost immediately Loshagin started contradicting himself in his statements. At first, he stated that on August 23, Yuliya left the house and went off in an unknown direction, taking her passport and handbag with her. He supposedly assumed at the time that his wife had gone to visit one of her friends. However, when Loshagin's apartment was searched, the passport was still there. In addition, Yuliya's iPhone, which she used for business negotiations, was also found in the apartment. The woman's relatives and acquaintances all said in unison that she would never go on a trip without her phone. Then Loshagin stated that Yuliya left home in his car on the night of August 23, but the car was found in a parking lot near their house. After learning about this, Loshagin stated that he had taken the car to the parking lot himself and that the car mysteriously appeared under his windows on August 24 during the day. "Why didn't you call the police?" was the next question. "After all, someone drove the car your wife left in right under your own windows." Loshagin found it difficult to answer, after which he refused to answer any further questions. He also refused to take a polygraph test, once again stating that he was not guilty of anything. The guests at the party mentioned by Loshagin, who were interviewed during the investigation, were unable to provide any additional information. Yuliya was indeed present at the event. She seemed happy and cheerful, and she didn't appear to have any arguments with Loshagin. However, no one could remember where she went after 11 p.m., but this alone didn't mean anything. The investigators hit a dead end. There was no direct evidence of Loshagin's guilt in causing his wife's death. In addition, there were no clear motives. Yuliya's brother and some of her friends claimed that the Loshagin family was going through a crisis and that Yuliya was ready to get a divorce. According to them, Loshagin was too fond of the bohemian lifestyle. He constantly needed inspiration and passion. He got a mistress, and his wife found out about it. Yuliya was a proud woman, and she didn't stay silent. The quarrels began. Loshagin became aggressive. He could raise his hand against Yuliya. He would grab her by the arms in the middle of an argument. However, some of Loshagin's friends claimed that it was Yuliya herself who was caught being unfaithful in the marriage. Moreover, it was recently discovered that the deceased had HIV. Loshagin was furious. That's exactly why the argument started.
We argue very passionately, but we get over it very quickly. I mean, literally 3 or 4 minutes and we're already making up and kissing. Then we make up and move on.
Yes, but it can be very intense. Well, tell us, how intense? Well, if Dima really doesn't like something, he might throw a glass of wine. I think something is already happening. I say, Amura, do you realize what you're doing? Yes, I've already come to terms with it.
That theory leaked to the press, but then this information was not confirmed. Tatiana Grigorieva, Loshagin's ex-wife, told the investigators that she saw Yuliya on the night of August 23rd at the Pushkin nightclub. She was not alone. She was with some group, several men. I don't know any of them, Grigorieva said. But this information also turned out to be unreliable. According to the phone records, Sotova was checked. Based on Loshagin's phone, it was established that on August 23 he was in the area where his wife's body was found. In the end, it was this circumstance that became decisive. Dmitry Loshagin was eventually charged under Part 1 of Article 105 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation for murder. By that time, he had completely refused to cooperate with the investigation and kept repeating that he was not guilty of anything. The case was high profile. Dmitry Loshagin was a figure known far beyond the borders of Yekaterinburg. The case was transferred to the First Department for Especially Important Cases of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation for Sverdlovsk region. Federal and local channels aired several reports on the case. In September 2013, Loshagin's lawyers filed a motion in court to change the preventive measure from arrest to a written pledge not to leave the area. In the motion, the lawyers drew attention to circumstances that the prosecution had previously omitted and which, in their opinion, indicated that Loshagin was not guilty of his wife's death. For example, Loshagin did indeed have tickets to Simferopol in his pocket, but there were also return tickets for September 9, 2013. This meant that Loshagin was planning to return. He wasn't planning to run away anywhere. In addition, the phone location data also raised doubts. At the moment the body was discovered, Yuliya Loshagin was at the Sports Palace, but just 11 seconds later he appeared on Svilinga Street, which is about 3 kilometers from that point. Well, although now anyone, at least in Russia, knows how it happens, your navigator just suddenly stops working. It loses signal, the GPS turns off, and suddenly you're not in the city center, but in the middle of the river. Maybe there was something similar there. Especially since, as the defense quite rightly argued, it's physically impossible to move 3 kilometers in 15 seconds, which means the phone location data was wrong and can't be trusted. The lawyers also criticized the investigator's statement that Loshagin announced the sale of his apartment the day after it was established that Yuliya had been killed. According to the documents provided by the defense, the apartment was put up for sale as early as August 16, that is, before Yuliya's death. Loshagin was earning a decent income, was a well-known and respected person, the lawyers reminded. He was described positively by colleagues and friends. He was madly in love with his wife and treated her like a queen. He simply wasn't capable of raising a hand against her. However, in this case, Loshagin's defenders kept silent about certain circumstances. Shortly before Yuliya's death, he was involved in a criminal case initiated under Article 116 of the Russian Criminal Code for battery. The complaint was filed by his ex-wife, Tatyana Grigorieva. At that time, the parties settled the matter amicably and reached a settlement agreement. However, the court took this circumstance into account. Loshagin is capable of attacking a woman. He has a cruel streak. The pretrial conditions remained unchanged. The official investigation was completed on July 10, 2014, and the case was handed over to the court. According to investigators, this is what happened. On August 22, 2013, Dmitry Loshagin held a party in his apartment in honor of the artist Yekaterina Loshagina. A group of friends well known to the couple gathered, including popular personalities of Yekaterinburg and the elite. 3 days before that, Yuliya Prokopieva had turned 28. At the party, Dmitry presented his wife with a luxurious bouquet and gave her a lovely toast. The guests applauded. Yuliya smiled. Everyone seemed to be happy. Around 10 in the evening, Loshagin invited his wife and the guests to the kitchen, to the rooftop, to admire the nighttime city skyline. They went up through the technical room on the 17th floor where they stayed for some time. Both the guests and the Loshagin couple were drunk. Loshagin was taking photos. After some time, Dmitry and Yuliya, along with several guests, returned to the loft, while the rest of the guests stayed on the roof. At 10:45 p.m., when they wanted to return inside, the guests discovered that the door leading to the loft was locked. It is presumed that Loshagin locked it. By that time, he and Yuliya were left alone in the loft and for some reason went into the utility room. One word led to another, and an argument broke out between the spouses. Perhaps jealousy was the reason. One of the witnesses would later say that Yuliya didn't like that Loshagin gave Ekaterina Ichkinskaya the same bouquet as he gave his wife. But overall, the reason for the argument remains unknown. Whatever the case, the drunken argument quickly turned into a fight. Loshagin snapped. Pushing his wife against the wall, he kicked Yuliya several times in the legs with his shoes on, then grabbed her by the neck. With a jerk, Yuliya's neck cracked as a vertebra broke. The woman went limp in her husband's arms and collapsed onto his hand. She was dead before she hit the floor. The whole crime took about 10 minutes. Loshagin locked Yuliya's body in the room, then returned to the remaining guests. By that time, the people locked on the roof had already started calling friends who had gone down to the loft with the Loshagins. Neither Yuliya's phone nor Dmitry's phone was answering. The key to the service exit was eventually found to be with the building administrator. The guests went home, the cleaners collected the trash, and Loshagin was left alone with his wife's corpse. Realizing that he needed to get rid of the body as soon as possible, he began undressing it. Soon, Loshagin brought a large transparent plastic container from somewhere. After placing Yuliya's body in it, he carried the container out of the apartment and put it in the trunk of his car. It was already morning outside. Driving onto the Staromoskovsky highway, Loshagin headed toward the village of Reshoti, where he stopped at the edge of the forest. He built a fire and placed his wife's naked body in the flames. After making sure it was burning, Loshagin left the forest and went home. He threw Yuli's clothes into a nearby river. He smashed Yuli's phone. After hearing the investigator's version, Loshagin once again stated that he was not guilty of anything. We were making plans for the future. We wanted to move to Prague and have children, he claimed. We were happy. However, Svetlana Ryabova, Yuliya's mother, knew that her daughter was not happy in her marriage. He was constantly controlling her. He was listening in on her phone calls. He started hitting her in 2012. What plans when my daughter was going to file for divorce and wanted to transfer the property to me? He was having an affair with Miss Yekaterinburg. Her decision was firm. The case against Loshagin was still based only on circumstantial evidence, and the defense took advantage of this. So, according to the investigation, after Loshagin took his wife's life, he carried her body out of the house in a polymer container. The defense, however, claimed that this was simply impossible. There were people in the loft at that time. Loshagin definitely wouldn't have been able to argue with his wife quietly, let alone beat her. In addition, there were 8 video cameras in the apartment and the studio, and one of them actually recorded the moment when Loshagin was bringing a container into the apartment. However, the size of the container was too small for a body to fit in easily. In order to fit Yuliya's body into the container, Loshagin would have had to put the body in a fetal position. Because of rigor mortis, Prokopyeva's body should have also been in a fetal position after being dumped and burned, but in the forest, the body was found in a different position. Moreover, after watching the video, it turned out that Loshagin did not take the container out of the apartment. In response to this, the forensic experts who studied the camera footage stated that part of the recording from the cameras was erased. In addition, the prosecution presented the court with footage from the building's entrance camera. It shows Loshagin carrying a large, semi-transparent plastic container out of the house with some object at the bottom. Then, the defense reminded the court that at the beginning of 2013, Loshagin broke both his ankles while vacationing at a ski resort, and it would have been extremely difficult for him to carry Yuliya's body, who weighed 55 kilograms, out of the house by himself, so maybe he isn't the criminal after all. Yuliya could have been killed by one of the guests or, for example, by employees of the catering service. After the party ended, 6 large boxes were carried out of the loft by 6 movers. Only the identities of 4 men could be established, and they definitely could not have been involved in Yuliya's death. But 2 of them still remain unidentified. The prosecution was standing on shaky ground. The perpetrator broke the victim's cervical vertebrae, which meant there was no blood evidence and no murder weapon. There were no witnesses to the crime, nor were there any witnesses to the Loshagin couple's quarrel. The phone records could also be called into question. There wasn't even a clear motive for the crime. All that remained was Loshagin's suspicious behavior and circumstantial evidence, but even those didn't help much. For example, during a second search of the apartment, fragments of a broken wide-bowled glass were found. The prosecution claimed that the glass was broken by the spouses during an argument, but the defense presented the court with photographs showing Yuliya and Dmitry drinking from narrow-necked glasses. In addition, forensic experts determined that the fingerprints on the fragments did not belong to Loshagin. A black fragment was found in the apartment. The investigation claimed that it was a piece of the shirt that Loshagin was wearing that day. Traces of sweat and skin oils were found on the fabric, but the examination revealed that they belonged neither to Loshagin nor to Yuliya. As it turned out later, the fabric could have been a piece of a dress or even a pillowcase. One of the witnesses in the case was someone named Vyacheslav Kolipin. In some sources, Kolipin is spelled with an A in the first syllable. He is a businessman. Some of Yuliya's friends and acquaintances claimed that she had an affair with him and that Loshagin found out about this relationship. This could have been the motive for the crime. Kolipin very reluctantly admitted that he was indeed acquainted with Yuliya and that they even used to go jogging together in the park. But we never had any intimate relationship. Never, he stated categorically. During the forensic examination, it was established that the last call from the victim's phone was made to Kolipin. The businessman did not answer it. The prosecution demanded that Dmitry Loshagin be found guilty and sentenced to 13 years in prison. Already in November 2014, the court was supposed to deliver a verdict, but the defense unexpectedly filed a motion for a repeat independent forensic examination to determine the cause and time of death of Yuliya Prokopieva. A specialist was invited to conduct the examination. He questioned the conclusion of the previous expert. According to him, the expert from Pervuralsk, Anna Chuloshnikova, did not determine how long the body had been in the forest, did not examine the livor mortis, did not measure the temperature of the remains, and did not indicate in the report the position of the neck muscles, the tongue, or the 5 bruises on the inner side of the thigh. And she did not mention the fact that food remnants were found in the stomach. Chuloshnikova also wrote that charred fragments of clothing were preserved on the remains of the body. However, the police report stated that the corpse was naked. In addition, it turned out that the expert did not examine Yuliya's kidneys during the autopsy, although she stated in her report that such an examination had been conducted. The new report stated that the left side of Yuliya's body was burned, including the skin and muscle tissue, while the right side of her body was almost unaffected by the fire. This means that the time of death could have been determined by the temperature of the internal organs. The report stated that the girl's death occurred 6 to 8 hours before she was found in the forest, which means on August 24th, not August 22nd. In addition, the expert also noted that in order to break his wife's neck with his bare hands, Loshagin would have had to possess great physical strength. According to the expert, the accused could not have inflicted such injuries on Yuliya. The forensic examination completely undermined the prosecution. At the final court session on December 25, 2014, Dmitry Loshagin was found not guilty and released. The verdict caused a storm of outrage among Yuliya's relatives, and the girl's mother stated that she would file an appeal. We had 2 more prosecution witnesses, but for some reason they were not called to court, the woman said. And she added that Loshagin, during one of the interrogations, did admit to 2 officers that he took his wife's life and disposed of the body. The woman did not name the officers at that time, but promised to bring them to court. After his release, Loshagin visited his wife's grave in Nizhny Tagil, willingly spoke with the media, and gave an interview. When speaking to journalists, he maintained that Yuliya went to a nightclub with her friend Layla on the night of August 23rd. He claimed that Yuliya was seen on the club's premises. He even stated that someone saw her in the following days. Loshagin claimed that Yuliya died on August 24, that is, 2 days after that party. He fully supported the invited experts' version. He also reluctantly admitted that he was indeed near the place where the body was found on August 23, but said that there is a campsite there where Yuliya sometimes liked to spend time. "I thought she might have gone there, so I went there myself," he said. While Loshagin was enjoying his newfound freedom, Yuliya's mother, Svetlana Ryabova, decided to take action. She signed a contract with the Moscow lawyer Evgeny Chernusov, and already in January 2015 they filed an appeal against Loshagin's acquittal. In the appeal, Chernusov pointed out numerous contradictions and violations committed by the invited expert when preparing the report. The expert did not refer to scientifically based methods of the Ministry of Health, but drew conclusions based almost solely on his own experience and opinion. The court had no right to base an acquittal on evidence obtained from a private specialist. At the hearing, the court heard testimony from 20 witnesses who had been guests at the party. They said they had not noticed any quarrels between Yuliya and Dmitry on the evening of August 22, 2013. However, noted Chernusov, this does not mean that Loshagin was not involved in his wife's death. The quarrel happened without witnesses. Their testimony could not be relied on when issuing an acquittal. Chernusov also commented on the evidence collected by the investigation. For example, he noted that as a result of the search in Loshagin's apartment, Prokopyeva's Russian and foreign passports were found, as well as the keys to 2 cars she used to drive and one of her mobile phones. Without these things, Yuliya would hardly have left home. The presence of these items at home, according to the instructions of the Russian Prosecutor General's Office for handling cases of missing persons, indicates that a deliberate crime was committed against Yuliya. At the end of January, a new witness appeared in the case, police operative Pavel Prokopchik. He claimed that at the moment Yuliya's body was discovered, her arms and legs were unnaturally bent. This could have confirmed the theory that Loshagin carried his wife's body out of the house in a container. Prokopchik also stated that during one of the interrogations, Loshagin confessed to him that he had an argument with Yuliya that night and pushed her, causing her to fall and break her neck. Pavel Prokopchik's report about Loshagin's confession was addressed to the head of the Criminal Investigation Department of the main directorate of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Sverdlovsk region, Alexander Mazayev, and it was included in the criminal case materials. According to the report, Dmitry Loshagin confessed that he transported Yuliya's body in a container to the area near the village of Reshoti, where he threw his wife's belongings into a local river and scattered his own things around nearby dumps. Despite the existence of the report, neither the investigation nor the court took a statement from Prokopchuk at that time, citing that he was an interested party. And yet, this testimony could have changed everything. In addition, Chernusov also wrote a letter addressed to State Duma Deputy Roman Kudyakov, in which he asked to involve employees of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Investigative Committee from Moscow in the investigation. At the beginning of February, Loshagin posted on his VKontakte page his messages with Prokopchuk, who allegedly demanded $50,000 from him in exchange for refusing to testify against him. Prokopchuk did not confirm the authenticity of this correspondence, but it did cause a stir. Information appeared in several media outlets and on the internet that an active law enforcement officer was engaged in extortion. In response to this, the press secretary of the main directorate of the Ministry of Internal Affairs for the Sverdlovsk region, Valery Gorelik, stated that this could be grounds for filing a lawsuit against Loshagin in order to protect Prokopchuk's business reputation. The court hearing to appeal the verdict took place on February 26 and lasted almost 5 hours. As a result, the acquittal of Dmitry Loshagin was overturned by the court and the case was sent back for further proceedings. As a preventive measure, Loshagin was placed under a travel ban. In its decision, the Sverdlovsk Regional Court relied on overlooked facts, incorrect assessments, and numerous violations of the Criminal Procedure Code committed by the investigation and the court of first instance. For example, surveillance camera footage from the night of August 22 to 23, 2013 showed that Yuliya entered the photo studio. After that, guests and catering staff also entered the premises, but none of them saw Yuliya. The trial court also did not pay attention to the fact that at some point, some of the guests ended up locked on the loft's roof. And the Loshagins suddenly stopped answering their phones at the same time, after which both of Yuliya's phones were turned off. Moreover, it turned out that the experts managed to recover a video recording from Loshagin's apartment made early in the morning on August 23rd. In the video, you can see a person in complete darkness by the glass doors, dragging some kind of object across the floor from the direction of the utility room with a flashlight in hand. Loshagin claimed that he was in the apartment alone on the morning of August 23rd, which means that the person in the video could only have been him. Loshagin himself, realizing that this time everything was not in his favor, defended himself desperately. More than once, he tried to accuse Svetlana Ryabova of simply making up her testimony. He even brought Yuliya's high school diploma, claiming that Svetlana had bought it. The court decided that the issue with the diploma was not relevant to the case. Loshagin's lawyers, however, were not idle either. They called a new defense witness to the court, Yuliya's agent, Alex Vernik. Vernik stated that the relationship between the Loshagins was good, and he knew nothing about any aggression from Dmitry. He stated that the modeling business is incompatible with domestic violence. Brands like Dolce & Gabbana and Prada impose penalties for bruises and tattoos on models. We always check the models before a shoot. If there is a bruise, we simply do not allow that model to work. Vernik, however, noted that Yuliya herself was quite quarrelsome, demanding, and had a tense relationship with Tatiana, Loshagin's ex-wife. Once, she even poured a glass of champagne over Tatiana's head at one of the Hyatt parties. The court was gradually descending into chaos. The defense brought in new experts, and they stated that they had tried to break Yuliya Prokopyeva's neck at least 4 times, and that the crime itself took place around 7 or 8 in the morning on August 24, 2013. And this contradicted the official version of the prosecution. There was also information that shortly before her death, Yuliya had been anally assaulted with a blunt object. On April 15, Tatiana Grigorieva herself appeared in court. Now, the woman was no longer defending her ex-husband. Tatiana stated that back at the first trial, Loshagin confessed to her that he accidentally took Yuliya's life when he pushed her during an argument and she fell. He took the body to the forest. He didn't call the police because there were illegal substances in the loft. Grigorieva also stated that Loshagin often complained to her about Yuliya's behavior. The woman really wanted a divorce, but Loshagin was against it. And then she started blackmailing him by threatening to file a police report because there were illegal items in the apartment. On May 23, 2013, on the TV program What Was That?, Dmitry Loshagin stated that he had become a victim of political expediency, and that the guilty verdict had already been handed down to him in absentia by the head of the Investigative Committee of Russia, Alexander Bastrikin, the chairman of the court, Alexander Dementiev, and the head of the Sverdlovsk police, Mikhail Borodin. The statement caused widespread public reaction, but as expected, Loshagin was unable to substantiate his claims in any way. On June 8, 2015, the final court session took place. At that hearing, Dmitry Loshagin delivered his final statement. In particular, he said the following: "I ask everyone, why would I throw all this away? For what purpose? Jealousy? That hasn't been proven and is at the very least foolish. Money? I have no financial gain from my wife's death, because I'm just crazy and an idiot. For some reason, people who have known me for many years haven't noticed that. Just like that, even if we didn't love each other, then why didn't I harm my 3 previous wives? You're asking why I refused the polygraph? I'll tell you, I don't trust you." And before moving on to the verdict and what happened next, I'll try to figure out what kind of person Dmitry Loshagin is. And he seems to be a complex and contradictory figure, combining the traits of a charismatic artist and a cold manipulator. His personality can be described as narcissistic with pronounced antisocial traits. He knew how to make an impression as a successful, charming person surrounded by admirers and the creative elite, but behind this facade was a tendency toward control, aggression, and pathological lying. The psychological profile of Loshagin is based on several key traits. First of all, there is extreme narcissism. He saw himself as the center of the universe, demanded admiration, and reacted painfully to any criticism or threat to his status. His public statements about loving his wife and dreaming of family happiness contrast with his real behavior, jealousy, aggression, and a desire to completely dominate his partner. Secondly, he clearly had a tendency toward manipulation. He skillfully played roles, adapting to situations. At times, he was the victim of an unfair trial, then a repentant husband, then a wrongfully convicted artist. Another important trait is emotional coldness. Even in the most dramatic moments, identifying bodies, arrest, trial, he did not show natural reactions of grief or fear, but rather a calculated restraint. His lies were calculated yet chaotic. He easily changed his testimony when the old versions fell apart, but he felt no guilt about the contradictions. This is typical for people with psychopathic tendencies who lack an internal moral barrier. His behavior after the conviction is interesting. Instead of remorse, he continued to deny his guilt, accusing the authorities and judges of fabricating the case. At the same time, he managed to adapt to the prison system, using his manipulation skills, for example, by participating in exposing corruption among the guards. This speaks to his high intelligence and ability to find benefit even in extremely unfavorable conditions. Overall, Loshagin is a typical example of a successful psychopath. Charming, intelligent, but lacking empathy and capable of cruelty when his interests are threatened. His story is an example of how narcissism and antisocial traits can hide behind the mask of a creative socialite. Could he have been his wife's executioner? Well, considering the psychological profile, yes, Loshagin could have taken a person's life. His narcissistic and psychopathic traits, pathological lying, lack of empathy, need for control, and capacity for aggression created a dangerous combination. First, the motive. Narcissists cannot tolerate losing control over their people. If Yuliya was really planning to leave, as her loved ones claimed, this could have triggered his rage. An alternative motive is jealousy, his or her infidelity, which also fits the pattern of narcissistic injury. The second way, breaking someone's neck is an impulsive but clean method. There's no blood, no need for a weapon. It could have been a spontaneous act of rage, like during an argument, rather than a premeditated killing. His athletic background and physical condition made that possible. Third, the behavior afterwards. His lies about his wife's whereabouts, his attempt to escape, and the destruction of Yuliya's phone are typical actions of guilty people trying to cover their tracks. Psychopaths are often sure they can outsmart the system. That's why he had chaotic but brazen excuses, like the story about the mystical return of the car. Fourth, the lack of remorse. Even in prison, he didn't admit his guilt, but that's not innocence, it's narcissistic defense. For such people, admitting guilt is the collapse of their ideal self. However, an important nuance, psychological predisposition does not equal proven guilt. He may not have taken his wife's life, but his behavior and personality made him the perfect suspect. So psychologically, yes, he was capable of taking a life, but legally the question remains debatable due to a lack of direct evidence. His guilt is very likely, but not beyond doubt. On June 24, 2015, a guilty verdict was delivered against Dmitry Loshagin. The court sentenced him to 10 years in a high-security penal colony. Loshagin appealed the verdict, and his prison term was reduced by 2 months. He was sent to serve his sentence in a penal colony in Novaya Lyalya. While in prison, Loshagin became a suspect in December 2015 in another crime, an attempted murder of prosecutor Mikhail Azdoev, who insisted on his guilt. The incident occurred late at night on May 30, 2015, shortly before the guilty verdict was delivered. The perpetrator set fire to a car tire in front of Azdoev's front door. The smoke from the tire filled the living area, and if Azdoev had been home, he would have suffocated. After that, the prosecutor attended the hearings only with security. At that time, Loshagin did take a polygraph test, but the results were inconclusive. He was not held accountable in this case. In the colony, Loshagin often worked as a photographer, covering various events. He even wanted to donate his photography equipment to the colony, but they didn't accept it. At the same time, he kept insisting that he was sent to prison for political reasons. I know for sure that the judge who tried me was made the head of the court after my trial, he told journalists in 2016. When the prosecutor, leaving the courtroom, asks the judge if he did everything right, and people heard it, what do you call that? In 2018, Rafik Zinatulin, the deputy head of the colony where Loshagin was imprisoned, was arrested on charges of abuse of power involving torture and sexual assault against inmates. Loshagin testified as a witness in this case. He admitted that he saw Zinatulin and 5 of his assistants torturing inmates and sexually assaulting them. He also stated that he was forced to pay money to the head of the colony, Sergei Sozinov, for 2 years in order not to become a victim of abuse himself.
There, you probably can't even take a shit alone. No, you can't just sit in peace. No. That's just messed up.
Loshagin's statement caused a public outcry once again. A new inspection was organized in the colony. Loshagin himself was transferred to another correctional facility to serve his sentence. During his imprisonment, Loshagin repeatedly filed petitions for parole and asked to have his imprisonment replaced with a restriction of freedom. But even if one court made a decision in his favor, another court would immediately overturn it. Finally, in the middle of 2022, Loshagin got lucky. His request for parole was granted, and this time the court found the arguments of the appellate court insufficient. On August 23, 2022, Dmitry Loshagin was released. Almost immediately, he started working as a photographer again. He got clients and journalists also reached out to him. Loshagin still denies his guilt in his wife's death and says he intends to simply move on with his life. He calls his time in prison a creative business trip. And what do you think about this case? Is Loshagin guilty or not? By the way, I'll post his interview on the Telegram channel and you can take a look at this person, see what he looks like, how he talks, and maybe draw your own subjective conclusions as well. Well, anyway, leave your comments, like or dislike, and watch other videos on the channel. They're right there in the end screens on your screen right now, and new ones come out even if you don't always get notifications about them, so make sure to subscribe and hit the bell.